Hello, my dear friends. No one expected that the drug once hailed as a medical miracle would become a silent nightmare that destroyed an entire generation. Doctors who once saved lives accidentally became the ones who dispensed the medicine, leading to tragedy. Mothers who gave their children miracle syrup did not know that it was a poison. Veterans returning from war found only a needle to survive the day. All of them turned morphine and laudanum into the greatest series of tragedies of this era. Tonight, you will join me in the story of how society created a pandemic and then turned its back on its victims. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If the Civil War in America seemed to close one chapter of violence, it quietly opened another that was less visible but no less destructive. The guns had stopped, the banners were folded, and families waited to welcome back fathers, brothers, and sons. Yet the men who returned were not the same as those who had left. Their bodies carried amputations, deep scars, and constant pain. Their minds carried sleepless nights and sudden tremors. Doctors had tried to save them with what was called a miracle of medicine. That miracle was morphine. On the battlefield, it had meant survival. At home, it meant a habit they could not put aside. Morphine had been celebrated during the war. Surgeons carried it in their kits, alongside bandages and saws. They injected it into men who were screaming in agony while their limbs were cut away. The drug dulled the unbearable pain and allowed soldiers to survive what would once have been fatal. In field hospitals, the small glass vials were treasured more than food or clothing. Every injection was thought of as mercy. For the soldiers, it was the only relief from endless suffering. They did not realize that the drug would follow them long after the battles were over. At first, no one questioned its continued use. A veteran who could not sleep after months of marching and fighting could take a dose. A man who woke shaking from nightmares could inject himself and find calm. A father who tried to return to farm work but felt constant agony could keep going with the help of morphine. They thought of it as medicine, not as danger. Addiction was not a word in common conversation. What they called it was relief. It is almost sarcastic that the same injection that once marked bravery on the battlefield was later whispered about as weakness when the soldier tried to live a normal life. Communities slowly began to notice. Men once strong were now pale and unsteady. In taverns, they looked for morphine instead of whiskey. In church pews, they excused themselves because they felt unwell, though it was not illness but craving. Neighbours whispered about what they saw. Families tried to keep it quiet. Soon, the phrase, "the soldier's disease," appeared in newspapers. It sounded medical, but it carried shame. Instead of sympathy, it became a label. The men were no longer seen as heroes. They were seen as damaged. The drug crept into daily life at home. Bottles were hidden in drawers or coat pockets. Needles were cleaned and used again and again. A wife might prepare dinner only to see her husband retreat to the bedroom with his vial. Children grew up watching their fathers drift into long hours of drowsiness. Morphine promised escape from pain, but it also created distance from life itself. If we compare it to modern times, it is like veterans returning from war and being handed opioids at every corner store, sold as casually as pain relievers. Doctors continued to prescribe it. To them, morphine was progress. It was safer than alcohol and more respectable than whiskey. Medical journals praised its power. Warnings about dependency were published but ignored. For doctors, it seemed unthinkable that a drug which saved lives could also destroy them. They wrote prescriptions freely, and patients obeyed. No one thought to question whether survival at such a cost was true survival at all. The results appeared everywhere. A farmer who had returned from war collapsed in his field because he could not keep up with his work. A factory worker who had once marched proudly now stumbled through his shifts, unable to focus without his dose. Employers avoided hiring them. Families withdrew from them. The soldier who once carried respect came to be viewed with suspicion. What had begun as mercy now looked like failure. Newspapers eventually took notice, but their reports offered little compassion. They described wasted men as warnings, not as victims. Politicians avoided the subject. Churches spoke of sin and weakness. Communities whispered about moral decline. Society wanted to celebrate victory, not admit that it had helped create a hidden epidemic. I cannot help but think that if I had lived in that time, I would have believed the vial was medicine, only to discover too late that it was a trap. Behind closed doors, the suffering deepened. A wife might sit at the table alone, knowing her husband was upstairs with his needle. A child might grow accustomed to silence, sensing that speaking too loudly would disturb a fragile mood. Neighbours who once respected a soldier might now cross the street to avoid him. The drug was not an outsider. It lived in kitchens, bedrooms, and parlours. It shaped the rhythm of ordinary life. The shame grew heavier as the years passed. Families rarely admit to their struggles. Veterans try to hide their dependence. Each man thought he carried a private burden, unaware that thousands shared the same fate. The silence kept the suffering invisible. What was described as the soldier's disease was not an individual's flaw, but a wound spread across the nation. Yet the nation turned its eyes away. The irony was harsh. Morphine had saved countless lives in the war. Without it, many soldiers would have died in agony. It was a tool of mercy, but mercy became dependency, and gratitude turned into blame. The same government and medical system that had pushed the drug into every field hospital now refused to deal with the consequences. Addiction was not acknowledged. It was hidden behind polite phrases and erased from official records. What remained was a generation of men caught between respect for their service and condemnation for their condition. The lessons were there, even if few cared to learn them. A medicine that erases pain can also erase control. A society that trusts doctors without question risks ignoring the darker sides of treatment. A community that leaves veterans to bear their struggles alone only deepens their wounds. The Civil War had ended, but another war had begun. This time, it was not fought with guns. It was fought with needles, in bedrooms and alleys, in silence and shame. The story of morphine after the war is not only about science, it is about how people treat their wounded when the fighting is over. It is about how comfort can become captivity. It is about how silence can make suffering worse. The men who had stood bravely on battlefields now stood alone in their homes, trying to survive another battle that no one else wanted to see. They were not weak. They were not villains. They were the first casualties of a crisis that was still unnamed. As the story of morphine after the Civil War unfolds, it becomes clear that what began as battlefield mercy was only the first step into something far darker, where the very doctors who saved lives would become the silent distributors of a new dependence that no one was prepared to face. Doctors became the next link in the spread of morphine. Every medical bag carried vials of the drug, carefully sealed, ready to be used on patients for any complaint. It was a routine tool, no different in their eyes from a stethoscope or a bottle of liniment. Prescriptions written out in neat handwriting opened the way for dependence that neither the doctors nor the patients recognized. The belief was simple. If a medicine eased pain, it was good. Few thought about what might happen when pain relief turned into a daily necessity. In the 19th century, medical training did not include the concept of addiction as we know it today. Physicians were taught to measure success by symptoms. If a patient came in restless, a dose of morphine calmed the nerves. If sleeplessness was the problem, morphine allowed rest. If stomach cramps kept someone doubled over, morphine soothed the pain. These results looked like proof. For doctors, the drug was efficient, scientific, and reliable. They were convinced that progress had given them a gift, and they reached for it again and again. It almost seems laughable now that entire careers were built on prescribing a drug without once questioning what happened when the bottle became permanent on a bedside table. Pharmacies filled the prescriptions with no restrictions. Small bottles of laudanum, often sweetened with alcohol, were sold as casually as cough syrup. Middle-class families bought them to manage stress. Wealthy households stocked them alongside tea and wine. In poorer neighborhoods, patients saved enough to buy small doses that could be stretched across weeks. The more doctors prescribed it, the more people came to expect it. Visits to the physician felt incomplete without the promise of morphine at the end. The pattern reinforced itself. A patient who found comfort returned to the same doctor, asking for another refill. The doctor, pleased to see improvement, gladly wrote another note. Each side believed the other was satisfied. Dependence grew in plain sight, dressed in the language of medicine. The drug was no longer only a battlefield cure. It was now woven into the fabric of civilian life, introduced not by soldiers but by trusted healers. Even doctors themselves were not immune. Long nights in hospitals, endless rounds of patients, and personal exhaustion pushed some to try the drug they carried. A small dose after midnight promised quick sleep. A larger dose dulled the headaches that came from stress. Before long, physicians found they needed what they had once offered. If we compared it to today, it would be like surgeons keeping a drawer full of strong opioids and slowly dipping into the supply themselves, convinced they had the knowledge to stay in control. The image of the physician as guardian of health made this even more dangerous. Patients trusted their word as absolute. Families followed instructions without hesitation. If a doctor said laudanum was harmless, then it was accepted as truth. In many households, the presence of a prescription erased any doubt. A substance signed by a physician could not possibly be a threat. This faith, unchallenged, allowed morphine to spread faster than any disease. Hospitals reflected the same reality. In wards filled with coughing patients or women weakened by childbirth, morphine was a standard part of treatment. Nurses administered it under orders, unaware that repeated doses might chain their patients to dependency. Medical records praised recovery but rarely noted the long-term effects. Relief was the only outcome worth measuring. When someone returned again and again for treatment, it was seen as proof of recurring illness, not as a sign of morphine's hold. The social impact widened. Patients who began with prescriptions soon shared bottles with relatives or neighbours. A father might give drops to his wife for her headaches. A mother might offer it to a friend struggling with sleepless nights. The line between medical use and casual sharing disappeared. What had started as professional advice now travelled hand to hand, neighbour to neighbour. Morphine had moved from hospital corridors into kitchens and parlours. Doctors who suspected something was wrong faced a dilemma. To admit the drug could be harmful meant admitting their own role in spreading it. Many chose silence. Others convinced themselves that the cases of overuse were rare exceptions. Medical journals that raised concerns were often ignored. The larger voice was still one of confidence, repeating the claim that morphine was a safe and modern solution. The narrative of progress left little room for doubt. I find it unsettling to imagine that some of the very men who taught generations of physicians were themselves struggling with the same needles they once carried proudly. By the end of the 19th century, morphine had reached nearly every layer of society, not because of soldiers returning from war, but because of prescriptions written by well-meaning physicians. Every bottle given to calm a cough, every vial used to soothe pain, strengthened the roots of dependence. The drug was no longer confined to moments of crisis. It became part of the daily routine, recommended by the most respected figures of the age. The tragedy lay in the trust. Patients had no reason to doubt their doctors. Families had no cause to suspect danger in something prescribed with authority. The responsibility that came with the title of physician meant that their mistakes carried far wider consequences. Morphine did not spread in secret. It spread in plain sight, through white coats and signed notes, through the very system meant to protect health. Over time, doctors realised that some patients could not stop coming back for more. Yet without the framework of addiction, they called it weakness or a fragile constitution. The idea that medicine itself might be the cause did not fit their understanding, so they continued to prescribe, continued to reassure, and continued to widen the circle of dependence. In this way, doctors became the most effective distributors, not out of malice, but out of ignorance. The irony was sharp. Medicine had stepped forward into the modern age, armed with syringes and bottles that promised progress. But progress blinded them to the truth. The healers who intended to reduce suffering became the very agents of a new form of suffering. The trust placed in them allowed morphine to spread faster than any law or policy could have managed. Their role as saviours quietly shifted into the role of suppliers. As the years went on, the pattern became harder to ignore. Families who had once thanked their doctors began to whisper about the strange dependence that followed each prescription. Communities saw patients return again and again with the same requests. The drug's hold deepened, and the medical profession carried it further still. The story of morphine was no longer about soldiers alone. It had entered every home through the doctor's hand. What no one expected was that the same bottles prescribed in trust would soon be found not just in the hands of patients, but in the handbags of wives and mothers, opening a chapter of dependence that touched even the most private corners of family life. Women soon became the next hidden chapter in the story of morphine and laudanum. In a society that expected wives and mothers to remain calm, patient, and obedient, doctors often wrote prescriptions without hesitation. A woman who appeared nervous or exhausted was told she was simply too sensitive, and the solution came in a small bottle. The label carried elegant lettering, the instructions were vague, and the promise was always the same: a few drops would keep the nerves steady. In a time when women's health was rarely taken seriously, this advice was followed without question. The quiet result was dependence that spread behind closed doors, unnoticed by the wider world. Laudanum became the companion of housewives. A few drops in the morning calmed the stomach, another dose in the afternoon dulled headaches, and before bed it brought sleep. Women who spent long days caring for children, managing households, and enduring social expectations found relief in the routine. At first, they believed it was harmless. They were not sneaking away to taverns, nor were they defying respectability. They were following medical advice, carrying a prescription written by a trusted doctor. It is almost absurd that the very same society that called women weak then handed them bottles that ensured they would become weaker still. The bottles fit neatly into daily life. Small enough to carry in a handbag, they travelled with women to visits, teas, and church gatherings. Friends exchanged stories of their use, some admitting to needing it more often than before. A woman could excuse herself from the parlour, take a sip, and return smiling, her composure restored. In this way, laudanum became both a secret and a shared experience. It allowed women to meet the expectations placed on them, but it also bound them to something they did not understand. Doctors encouraged this use. They described laudanum as a tool for restoring balance to the female constitution. Nervousness, melancholy, or irritability, all could be soothed with the right measure. Women who questioned their reliance were told it was natural to need a little help. Their concerns were dismissed as imagination. The message was clear: to be a good wife and mother, one must not appear unsettled. Laudanum became the invisible glue holding up the facade of domestic harmony. The reality was different. Behind bedroom doors, women grew restless when bottles ran low. Sleepless nights returned, headaches sharpened, and moods swung wildly. Some sent their husbands to fetch more, others begged doctors for refills, and many learned to buy directly from apothecaries. Dependence spread quietly, hidden beneath the veneer of respectability. What appeared as poise in public was often maintained only by the drops of opium in alcohol that women consume daily. If we compare it to today, it would be like telling every anxious housewife to carry around a bottle of prescription painkillers and refill it without limits, all while insisting it was perfectly safe. Families rarely spoke of it. Husbands often preferred their wives to be calm and compliant, and if a bottle of laudanum achieved that, they did not ask questions. Children grew up seeing their mothers sip from small glass vials, not knowing what it meant. Friends recognized the habit but treated it as ordinary. There was no shame, only acceptance. Society did not see addiction. It saw women who behaved as expected. The illusion worked so well that thousands of women slipped deeper into dependency without anyone naming it. The apothecaries profited from this silent demand. They advertised laudanum as a solution for female troubles, designing labels that appealed to women's sense of refinement. Some bottles looked more like perfume than medicine, with gilded caps and delicate glass. They were meant to be carried openly, displayed without embarrassment. The elegance disguised the danger. What looked like a fashionable accessory was, in truth, a tether to a substance that would not let go. Over time, women began to notice changes in themselves. Some felt they could no longer get through a day without laudanum. Others realized their moods collapsed when they tried to stop. A few recognized that their bodies were weaker, their energy fading even as their bottles emptied faster. Yet they had no framework to describe what was happening. Addiction was not a term offered to them. They were told they were fragile, that their constitutions required constant care. In this way, their suffering was blamed on their nature, not on the drug that caused it. The tragedy was compounded by isolation. Unlike soldiers who gathered in groups, women endured their struggles in private. Each household believed it was alone. Each wife thought her reliance was unique. But across towns and cities, thousands shared the same story. The silence ensured that the epidemic remained invisible. The habit was mistaken for refinement, the weakness mistaken for femininity. It was a nationwide dependence hiding in plain sight. Doctors remained central to this pattern. Their authority gave legitimacy to the bottles they prescribed. Their ignorance kept them from seeing the harm, and their own occasional use blurred the line between healer and patient. In their minds, they were offering solutions. In reality, they were passing along shackles. The trust placed in them amplified the spread more effectively than any advertisement. By prescribing laudanum so casually, they created a cycle of need that could not easily be broken. I can't help but feel that if I had been a woman in that time, I too might have clung to a small bottle, convinced it was helping me keep order in a world that demanded constant calm. The broader culture supported this silence. Newspapers ran ads praising laudanum as a gift to mothers. Social gatherings made a quiet space for their use. Clergy rarely spoke against it, choosing to focus on more visible sins. The acceptance was complete. What was happening in private bedrooms and handbags was never recognized as a crisis. Instead, it was woven into the daily rhythm of respectable life. Yet the longer it continued, the deeper the consequences became. Some women collapsed unexpectedly, their bodies weakened by years of steady use. Others found themselves unable to care for children without doses to keep them steady. A few withdrew from social life entirely, ashamed of their growing dependence but unable to escape it. The pattern was the same everywhere. A trusted prescription became a daily necessity, and a daily necessity became a hidden chain. Laudanum was not only shaping the health of women, it was reshaping households, marriages, and communities. The drug had moved from the battlefield into the family parlour, from the surgeon's kit into a mother's purse. Its grip was silent, but it was strong. The women who relied on it were not considered addicts. They were considered refined. That illusion blinded society to the scale of the problem. What began as advice for sensitive nerves was turning into something more dangerous. The small bottles that looked elegant in handbags were also finding their way into children's mouths, offered by parents who believed they were giving comfort. The story was about to widen, and its consequences would become even more tragic. The bottles themselves began to tell a story. They were no longer plain containers of medicine. By the late 19th century, Opium mixtures such as laudanum were packaged in glass that looked closer to perfume than to something dangerous. Advertisements praised their elegance, with labels decorated in flowing letters and gold trim. The designs suggested refinement and safety. A bottle could sit openly on a lady's vanity or on a shelf in the parlour, admired for its appearance. This was not medicine meant to be hidden. It was medicine disguised as beauty, a product that fit comfortably into the world of domestic respectability. The labels went further than elegance. They carried assurances that sound shocking today. Some declared that the product was not addictive, despite its opium base. Others even advertised it as safe for children. Mothers were encouraged to use it when infants cried too long. The promise was peace in the home, rest for parents, and quiet in the nursery. For households already stretched by large families and sleepless nights, this was irresistible. The fact that the solution came in a lovely bottle only made it easier to trust. It almost feels sarcastic to imagine that a society so anxious about appearances believed a dangerous drug was safe simply because it came in a gilded container. Women who already carried small vials for their nerves now had bottles marketed directly to them for family use. Some were labelled as soothing syrups, others as infant quieters. The names were gentle, chosen to inspire comfort. Mothers poured drops into spoons, held them to tiny lips, and waited for silence. For many, it seemed like an act of care. The children calmed, the household rested, and the mother's own sense of exhaustion eased. Few stopped to wonder why a child grew unnaturally still, or why sleep seemed too deep. The market for these bottles grew quickly. Apothecaries displayed them prominently in windows. Newspapers ran ads that described them as essential items for any home. They were not presented as medicine, but as conveniences. For the wealthy, they joined the array of elegant domestic supplies, alongside tea and fine china. For the poor, they were cheaper than a doctor's visit and promised quicker relief than patients could offer. In this way, the bottles crossed all social boundaries. They became part of everyday life in every neighbourhood. The reality, however, was that these bottles carried real danger. Children's bodies could not process the strength of the opium inside. Some babies slipped into long sleeps from which they did not wake. Others grew weak and frail. Their development slowed by repeated dosing. Yet the advertisements continued, the sales grew, and the belief that they were harmless endured. If we compared it to today, it would be like finding morphine cough syrup sold in supermarkets with bright labels promising safe use for toddlers. Mothers trusted what they saw in print. They trusted the bottles that looked refined. They trusted the doctors who reassured them. When children died suddenly, the cause was rarely blamed on laudanum. It was recorded as weakness, illness, or bad fortune. This shield of ignorance allowed the cycle to continue. Parents who had lost one child might continue to use the same bottles for others, never realizing the risk they were repeating. The culture of trust in medicine, packaging, and authority ensured that the truth stayed hidden. The advertising industry played a central role. Words like soothing and safe covered the reality of dependency and danger. Companies invested in ornate printing, convincing slogans, and polished endorsements. They understood that a product dressed in beauty would be welcomed into homes. In an age where branding was becoming a new art, laudanum and opium mixtures became some of the most successful examples. The irony was sharp. The very skills used to sell luxury goods were now being used to sell bottles that carried quiet harm into families. Inside homes, the bottles became fixtures. Mothers reached for them as readily as they reached for food or blankets. Children grew up watching these bottles used as solutions for every problem: crying, sleeplessness, and restlessness. The line between medicine and poison disappeared completely. Dependence began at the earliest ages, not just for mothers but for the children themselves. The seeds of future reliance were planted in infancy, with each drop carefully administered by loving hands that did not realize the danger. The elegance of the bottles made them socially invisible. Guests might see them on a mantel and think nothing of it. a mother could take them from her purse without shame. They were not associated with vice or desperation. They were associated with refinement, responsibility, and good parenting. That illusion made them even more dangerous. The more respectable they appeared, the more likely they were to be used without hesitation. Doctors played into this culture as well. Many prescribed these mixtures as routine, reinforcing the idea that they were safe. Others simply looked away, allowing the apothecaries and advertisements to spread their message. Even when cases of infant deaths were whispered about, the medical community hesitated to take responsibility. It was easier to blame fate than to question the products that had become so profitable and so popular. The deeper tragedy lay in the trust of families. Mothers did not intend harm. They believed they were caring for their children, following advice, and keeping their homes peaceful. Fathers accepted the practice because it gave them quiet nights and rested wives. Grandparents saw it as modern progress. The entire structure of society supported the use of these bottles, and so the harm continued silently. The gilded bottles, once admired for their beauty, became silent witnesses to countless private struggles. They were objects of trust that delivered not safety but risk. They show how dependence could spread not only through soldiers and patients, but through the smallest members of society. The power of design, advertising, and misplaced faith turned dangerous drugs into everyday household items. Over time, the evidence grew harder to ignore. Reports of infant deaths circulated quietly, and doctors began to notice patterns of dependency in women who had used the mixtures for years. Yet the momentum of acceptance was difficult to stop. The bottles remained, the advertisements continued, and families kept trusting what looked respectable. Addiction had been made beautiful, and because of that, it was nearly impossible to see. What began as an elegant solution for restless mothers was becoming a tragedy for their children. The very bottles that sat proudly on mantels and in handbags were also the tools of silent loss. And as these bottles spread from nurseries to every corner of society, the image of beauty would soon give way to a far darker picture, the collapse of returning soldiers who clutched syringes in the shadows of city alleys. The figure of the addicted veteran became one of the most haunting images in post-Civil War America, in city alleys, in dim boarding houses, and sometimes even on the steps of public buildings. Men who had once worn uniforms of honor were now seen slumped against walls, clutching syringes in trembling hands. They were not wounded by fresh bullets or bayonets, but by the quiet poison of the drug that had been given to them during the war. The sight unsettled communities. What had been framed as battlefield medicine now appeared in the streets as a new kind of ruin. Newspapers began to use a phrase that would linger the soldier's disease. It was a polite way of describing dependence on morphine. The word suggested that addiction was limited to veterans, a medical condition tied only to war injuries. But the phrase also carried judgment. It reduced the men to a single failing, as if their reliance on the drug erased their years of sacrifice. Instead of sympathy, the label encouraged distance. People read the stories, nodded in recognition, and moved on. Soldiers who had given their strength to the nation were now framed as examples of weakness. It is strikingly cruel that the same society that once decorated these men with medals now treats them as objects of caution, like broken warnings scattered across the streets. The alleys and taverns of American cities became their refuge. Without work, without support, and without understanding from their families, many veterans drifted into spaces where they could use morphine in relative peace. They leaned against walls, eyes half closed, hands gripping the only tool they felt they could trust. The syringe became as familiar as a weapon once had been, but now it carried no honor. It delivered only short relief, followed by deeper need. The image of the soldier collapsed in an alley with a needle at his side captured the public imagination, and not with kindness. It was treated as a scandal, not as a tragedy. Communities responded with fear rather than help. Families who had once been proud to hang portraits of their sons in uniform now hid their struggles behind closed doors. Employers refused to hire veterans who looked frail or restless. Churches spoke in vague terms about the weakness of will. No organized system of support existed. There were no treatment centers, no counseling, no recognition of addiction as a medical problem. The men were left to face their condition alone, watched but not assisted by the very communities they had fought to protect. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like seeing injured soldiers return from overseas deployments only to be left homeless and addicted. While the nation moved on without them, the cultural impact was heavy. The phrase "the soldier's disease" spread widely, shaping how people thought of veterans. It created a stigma that followed them into every space. Instead of being welcomed as survivors, they were seen as burdens. The public avoided acknowledging that it was medicine, not personal choice, that had started their dependence. It was easier to treat the problem as moral weakness than as a result of medical practice. This choice ensured that veterans not only suffered physically, but also socially, locked out of the communities they had once defended. Doctors who had prescribed the drug often stayed silent. Admitting responsibility would have meant acknowledging their own role in creating the crisis. Politicians did not want to connect national pride with national shame, and so the addicted veteran became an image without defenders. He appeared in articles and sermons, but rarely in conversations that sought real solutions. The country preferred to look away, to treat the suffering as an unfortunate side effect of war, rather than as an ongoing epidemic. The lives of these veterans became stories of isolation. Many wandered from town to town, looking for work that never lasted. Others remained at home but withdrew from their families, ashamed of their dependence. Some ended up in asylums or poorhouses, institutions that treated them not with care but with confinement. The men who had once marched in disciplined rows were now scattered figures, each carrying his own battle with a bottle or a syringe. Their dignity was stripped twice, first by the war and then by the society that refused to understand their pain. The tragedy grew deeper because it was so visible. Children saw these men on street corners. Wives passed them in markets. Employers encountered them begging for work. Their presence could not be denied, yet it was never addressed. Instead, the public narrative hardened the soldiers had survived battle, but had failed at peace. They were blamed for their own condition, accused of weakness, and pushed further into the margins. I cannot shake the thought that if I had lived in that time, I too might have believed the stories in the newspapers, nodding along with the blame instead of seeing the truth in the veterans' hollow eyes. The syringes themselves became symbols. Once instruments of survival, they were now associated with disgrace. Found beside the bodies of veterans in alleys, they reinforced the idea that these men had surrendered to vice. Few people stopped to remember that the syringes had once been given to them by army doctors as tools of mercy. The instrument had not changed. What changed was the way society chose to interpret it. The very same needle that had saved lives in war now marked its user as a failure in peace. The shame ensured silence. Veterans who struggled rarely spoke openly. Families kept their suffering hidden. Communities preferred whispers to conversations. This silence made the epidemic harder to confront. Without public recognition, the addicted soldier remained a figure of pity and scorn, not of support. The absence of understanding allowed the crisis to deepen, spreading from soldiers to civilians, from men to women, from the battlefield to the parlour. By the end of the century, the image was fixed. The addicted veteran slumped in an alley became one of the enduring symbols of the nation's failure to care for its wounded. The phrase "the soldier's disease" lived on, shaping how people thought about addiction long after the war was over. Instead of sparking compassion, it hardened judgment. The nation chose stigma over support, and in doing so, it abandoned many of the very men who had once carried its flag. What began as battlefield relief had turned into a national emblem of decline. The veterans who had been promised gratitude were left instead with suspicion. Their dependence was seen not as the legacy of war but as a personal failing. This distortion of truth ensured that the problem would spread unchecked, From this point on, addiction was not just a private struggle. It was a public image, used to warn, to shame, and to distance. And yet, what society had begun to see on the faces of veterans was only a preview of what was coming. For soon, even the doctors themselves, the very men who had first prescribed the drug, would be caught in the same spiral, trapped by the same syringes they once carried as symbols of progress. The image of addicted veterans had already unsettled society, but the quiet tragedy reached even deeper when doctors themselves became entangled in the same dependence. These were the men who had prescribed morphine with confidence, convinced it was progress. They carried it in their medical bags, administered it in homes and hospitals, and wrote notes that made apothecaries rich. Yet behind closed doors, many of them reached for the same vials. They used the drug not on patients, but on themselves. The healers were no longer only prescribing relief, they were consuming it, caught in the grip of the substance they had once believed was their tool. For doctors, the pathway to dependence often began innocently. Long nights of visiting patients, performing surgeries, and responding to emergencies left them exhausted. A small injection promised sleep. Another dose calmed headaches after hours of study or travel. The temptation was strong because the supply was always near. The drug was in their pockets, their cabinets, and their offices. Using it required no persuasion, no cost, no shame in the eyes of others. They told themselves it was temporary, just a way to manage stress. But what was meant to be occasional soon became routine. The danger was even greater because doctors trusted their own judgment. They believed they could control the dosage, that their knowledge made them immune to the risks. They saw themselves as different from their patients. They were educated, disciplined, and professional. The drug could not master them, or so they thought. Over time, their bodies proved them wrong. The cravings grew, the reliance deepened, and the excuses faded. The medical men who once spoke with authority found themselves living in quiet contradiction. It is grimly ironic that those who claimed to guard public health were secretly eroding their own with every dose. Some tried to stop. A few locked away their vials, determined to endure the sleepless nights and the headaches. But withdrawal was cruel. Their hands trembled, their hearts raced, and their minds filled with restless despair. Without the drug, they could not work, and without work, they could not maintain the reputation their profession demanded. Patients did not know why their trusted doctor suddenly appeared pale and unsteady. Families did not understand why a respected husband or father seemed to vanish into long hours of weakness. The struggle was invisible to all but the men themselves. Others kept using quietly, hiding their condition with the same skill they used to hide the pain of patients. They learned to administer small doses between visits, to slip away from households under the pretense of needing rest, to refill bottles without raising suspicion. Their authority protected them. No one questioned the doctor's right to carry morphine. No one suspected that the very man trusted to heal was also a man bound by the same chains he once claimed to cut. The silence weighed heavily. Medical culture at the time had little room for confession. A doctor who admitted weakness risked losing patients, income, and respect. To say that he was dependent on morphine would have been unthinkable. So many wrote their truth not in public but in private journals. Pages were filled with self-recrimination and despair. One haunting line appeared in more than one account. Each injection is an apology. These men knew they were caught. They knew they were failing both themselves and the oath they had sworn. Yet the drug pulled them back every time. For some, the spiral ended in suicide. Unable to endure withdrawal, unable to admit their condition, they chose to end their lives rather than continue in the shadow of shame. Families covered these deaths with polite explanations. Newspapers avoided scandal by speaking of sudden illness. The truth remained hidden. Doctors who had spent their lives saving others left the world in silence, their final moments marked by a needle and a vial. If we compared it to today, it would be like surgeons overdosing on the very opioids they prescribe to patients, while hospitals quietly mark the cause of death as exhaustion. The tragedy of addicted physicians revealed the deeper flaw of the era. If even those with medical knowledge and authority could not resist morphine, what chance did ordinary people have? The belief that the drug was safe crumbled when doctors themselves fell victim. Yet society rarely acknowledged this openly. To admit that healers were suffering meant admitting that medicine itself had failed. Instead, whispers circulated quietly within the profession, while the public remained unaware of the extent of the crisis. Patients noticed the signs without understanding them. Some remarked that their doctor looked weary or distracted. Others felt their prescriptions were written more casually than before. A few suspected that something was wrong but dared not accuse a man of science. The trust placed in doctors was too strong, and the stigma too heavy. The result was a system where dependence spread at every level but was rarely confronted. The silence protected reputations but destroyed lives. Hospitals and medical schools offered no solutions. There were no treatment centres, no support groups, no professional structures to address the issue. A doctor who fell into addiction had only two choices: continue in secret or end his life. The profession that prided itself on healing had no tools for its own. The image of the doctor remained untarnished in public, but in private, more and more men carried the burden of dependence that they could not share. The broader culture contributed to the silence. Society already viewed addiction with suspicion, calling it weakness or sin. To discover that doctors themselves were caught would have damaged trust in medicine. So the truth was hidden, and the myth of medical infallibility continued. The addicted doctor became an unspoken reality, present but denied. His suffering was buried under layers of respectability, leaving him to face his decline alone. This hidden crisis deepened the epidemic. Doctors who used morphine for themselves were less cautious in prescribing it to others. Their familiarity dulled their fear. Their need encouraged broader availability. The cycle of supply and use widened, pushed along by the very men society trusted most. The irony was devastating. The protectors had become conduits. The healers had become examples of the very affliction they refused to name. I cannot help but feel that if I were a physician in that time, exhausted by endless patients and lacking any understanding of addiction, I too might have reached for the vial and told myself it was just another tool of the trade. The story of addicted doctors remained largely untold during the century, but its effects rippled outward. Families who lost physicians to morphine carried grief without explanation. Patients whose care declined quietly suffered. Communities that trusted their doctors never learned the full truth. What was hidden in journals and whispered in private rooms was never acknowledged as part of the broader crisis. The silence preserved the image of medicine, but it also preserved the epidemic. What had started with soldiers in alleys was now revealed in the lives of doctors themselves. Addiction was not limited to the wounded or the poor. It had reached the very heart of the profession meant to control it. And yet, even this was not the darkest chapter. Soon, the bottles that ruined veterans and doctors alike would be placed in the mouths of infants, turning the epidemic into a tragedy that reached even the most fragile lives. The image of addicted veterans had already unsettled society, but the quiet tragedy reached even deeper when doctors themselves became entangled in the same dependence. These were the men who had prescribed morphine with confidence, convinced it was progress. They carried it in their medical bags, administered it in homes and hospitals, and wrote notes that made apothecaries rich. Yet behind closed doors, many of them reached for the same vials. They used the drug not on patients but on themselves. The healers were no longer only prescribing relief. They were consuming it, caught in the grip of the substance they had once believed was their tool. For doctors, the pathway to dependence often began innocently. Long nights of visiting patients, performing surgeries, and responding to emergencies left them exhausted. A small injection promised sleep. Another dose calmed headaches after hours of study or travel. The temptation was strong because the supply was always near. The drug was in their pockets, their cabinets, and their offices. Using it required no persuasion, no cost, no shame in the eyes of others. They told themselves it was temporary. just a way to manage stress. But what was meant to be occasional soon became routine. The danger was even greater because doctors trusted their own judgment. They believed they could control the dosage, that their knowledge made them immune to the risks. They saw themselves as different from their patients. They were educated, disciplined, and professional. The drug could not master them, or so they thought. Over time, their bodies proved them wrong. The cravings grew, the reliance deepened, and the excuses faded. The medical men who once spoke with authority found themselves living in quiet contradiction. It is grimly ironic that those who claim to guard public health were secretly eroding their own with every dose. Some tried to stop. A few locked away their vials, determined to endure the sleepless nights and the headaches. But withdrawal was cruel. Their hands trembled, their hearts raced, and their minds filled with restless despair. Without the drug, they could not work, and without work, they could not maintain the reputation their profession demanded. Patients did not know why their trusted doctor suddenly appeared pale and unsteady. Families did not understand why a respected husband or father seemed to vanish into long hours of weakness. The struggle was invisible to all but the men themselves. Others kept using quietly, hiding their condition with the same skill they used to hide the pain of patients. They learned to administer small doses between visits, to slip away from households under the pretense of needing rest, to refill bottles without raising suspicion. Their authority protected them. No one questioned the doctor's right to carry morphine. No one suspected that the very man trusted to heal was also a man bound by the same chains he once claimed to cut. The silence weighed heavily. Medical culture at the time had little room for confession. A doctor who admitted weakness risked losing patients, income, and respect. To say that he was dependent on morphine would have been unthinkable. So many wrote their truth not in public but in private journals. Pages were filled with self-recrimination and despair. One haunting line appeared in more than one account. Each injection is an apology. These men knew they were caught. They knew they were failing both themselves and the oath they had sworn. Yet the drug pulled them back every time. For some, the spiral ended in suicide. Unable to endure withdrawal, unable to admit their condition, they chose to end their lives rather than continue in the shadow of shame. Families covered these deaths with polite explanations. Newspapers avoided scandal by speaking of sudden illness. The truth remained hidden. Doctors who had spent their lives saving others left the world in silence, their final moments marked by a needle and a vial. If we compared it to today, it would be like surgeons overdosing on the very opioids they prescribe to patients, while hospitals quietly mark the cause of death as exhaustion. The tragedy of addicted physicians revealed the deeper flaw of the era. If even those with medical knowledge and authority could not resist morphine, what chance did ordinary people have? The belief that the drug was safe crumbled when doctors themselves fell victim. Yet society rarely acknowledged this openly. To admit that healers were suffering meant admitting that medicine itself had failed. Instead, whispers circulated quietly within the profession, while the public remained unaware of the extent of the crisis. Patients noticed the signs without understanding them. Some remarked that their doctor looked weary or distracted. Others felt their prescriptions were written more casually than before. A few suspected that something was wrong but dared not accuse a man of science. The trust placed in doctors was too strong, and the stigma too heavy. The result was a system where dependence spread at every level but was rarely confronted. The silence protected reputations but destroyed lives. Hospitals and medical schools offered no solutions. There were no treatment centres, no support groups, no professional structures to address the issue. A doctor who fell into addiction had only two choices: continue in secret or end his life. The profession that prided itself on healing had no tools for its own. The image of the doctor remained untarnished in public, but in private, more and more men carried the burden of dependence that they could not share. The broader culture contributed to the silence. Society already viewed addiction with suspicion, calling it weakness or sin. To discover that doctors themselves were caught would have damaged trust in medicine. So the truth was hidden, and the myth of medical infallibility continued. The addicted doctor became an unspoken reality, present but denied. His suffering was buried under layers of respectability, leaving him to face his decline alone. This hidden crisis deepened the epidemic. Doctors who used morphine for themselves were less cautious in prescribing it to others. Their familiarity dulled their fear. Their need encouraged broader availability. The cycle of supply and use widened, pushed along by the very men society trusted most. The irony was devastating. The protectors had become conduits. The healers had become examples of the very affliction they refused to name. I cannot help but feel that if I were a physician in that time, exhausted by endless patients and lacking any understanding of addiction, I too might have reached for the vial and told myself it was just another tool of the trade. The story of addicted doctors remained largely untold during the century, but its effects rippled outward. Families who lost physicians to morphine carried grief without explanation. Patients whose care declined quietly suffered. Communities that trusted their doctors never learned the full truth. What was hidden in journals and whispered in private rooms was never acknowledged as part of the broader crisis. The silence preserved the image of medicine, but it also preserved the epidemic. The graves of infants were hidden behind polite words and elegant labels. Families mourned while companies denied responsibility. Soon, even the most respected figures in art, faith, and high society would fall under the same spell. Addiction did not stop with soldiers, doctors, or mothers. By the late 19th century, morphine and laudanum had spread into the lives of writers, clergy, and members of the aristocracy. The bottles that once sat in hospitals and nurseries now appeared on the desks of authors, on the nightstands of clergymen, and in the libraries of gentlemen's clubs. Dependence had crossed every social boundary, weaving itself into art, religion, and culture. No class of society remained untouched, and no role was too sacred to escape the reach of opium. Writers were among the most visible users. The creative process was exhausting, and many believed laudanum sharpened their thoughts, expanded their imagination, and eased the loneliness of long nights at the desk. Some admitted in private that they could not produce without it. Famous poems, essays, and novels were shaped under the influence of a substance that blurred the line between inspiration and sedation. Readers praised the brilliance of the words, but never saw the small bottle sitting beside the ink and paper. It is almost sarcastic to think that an entire culture celebrated the genius of literature, while ignoring that many pages were written under the haze of a narcotic. Clergymen were not immune. Sermons were often prepared late at night, after long days of pastoral duties, for men expected to speak calmly and with authority before their congregations. Laudanum offered steady nerves. A dose before Sunday service ensured that a trembling voice would sound strong. Parishioners listened with trust, unaware that the words of comfort came from a man steadied by opium. The contradiction was rarely seen and never spoken of. Religious figures who might condemn weakness in their sermons quietly consumed the same substance that ruined the lives of their parishioners. Among the aristocracy, addiction took on a veneer of refinement. Morphine injections were spoken of as habits of intellect, a tool for the cultivated mind. In private clubs and drawing rooms, men and women of status treated their use of the drug as proof of sophistication. Bottles were carried discreetly in handbags or displayed as if they were rare spirits. Dependence was not only accepted but admired. To refuse a dose might even have been seen as provincial, a sign of lacking taste. The same society that condemned poor veterans in alleys celebrated its own indulgence as cultured behaviour. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like elite professionals praising their reliance on prescription sedatives as marks of refinement, while shaming the working class for the same struggle. The universality of addiction made it harder to confront. When every class participated, no single group could be blamed. The poor used morphine to numb their aching muscles. Women used it to manage nerves and exhaustion. Children were given syrups to keep them quiet. Doctors and clergy turned to it for relief, while writers and aristocrats claimed it enhanced their intellect. Addiction became invisible because it was everywhere. It was not seen as a crisis, but as part of ordinary life. The literary world reinforced this normalization. Journals and magazines published works by authors known to rely on laudanum, sometimes even hinting that the drug gave them unusual insight. Readers consumed the words without questioning their source. The brilliance of the writing obscured the suffering behind it. For those who admired the arts, the association of narcotics with creativity made dependence appear almost glamorous. The romantic image of the struggling artist overshadowed the harsh truth of failing health, wasted lives, and early deaths. In churches, congregations looked to their leaders for moral guidance, never suspecting that some of those leaders relied on laudanum to maintain composure. The contradiction remained hidden, but its presence shaped sermons and decisions. Faith was meant to provide strength, yet even men of God reached for bottles when the weight of responsibility grew too heavy. This quiet reliance suggested that the drug was not just a problem for the weak, but a temptation strong enough to touch even those considered closest to moral authority. In aristocratic homes, addiction shaped culture more directly. Dinner parties included quiet pauses where guests excused themselves for small doses. Clubs provided private rooms where gentlemen could steady their hands with injections. Conversations about politics and art flowed more smoothly under the influence, giving the illusion of clarity. Dependence became woven into the rituals of elite society, hidden beneath the language of refinement. The hypocrisy was striking. The same upper classes that labelled poor users as degraded framed their own habits as signs of intelligence and progress. I cannot help but feel that if I had lived among them, I too might have mistaken the presence of laudanum at a dinner table as simply another symbol of sophistication. The spread of addiction into all classes revealed a deeper truth about society. The drug was not limited to the desperate. It was part of the very fabric of culture. It shaped the words people read, the sermons they heard, and the gatherings they attended. It blurred lines between sacred and profane, between intellect and weakness. Every role in society carried its own justification for using it. Writers claimed inspiration, clergy claimed composure, aristocrats claimed refinement. In reality, all were bound by the same need, carried in the same bottles, and hidden behind the same silence. This silence allowed the epidemic to grow unchecked, because everyone was involved. No one wanted to raise an alarm. To admit the danger meant confronting the truth about one's own family, friends, or leaders. It was easier to pretend that the problem belonged only to others. The universality of addiction made it invisible. The very scale of the epidemic ensured that it could not be acknowledged until it was too late. By the close of the century, morphine and laudanum had become part of the daily rhythm of society. From the poorest labourer to the wealthiest aristocrat, from the pews of churches to the pages of novels, addiction was everywhere. The epidemic no longer had a single face. It had the face of everyone. This universality made it impossible to deny, yet the denial continued. The drug that had once been praised as progress had become the quiet master of an entire culture. Addiction was no longer limited to soldiers, mothers, or artists. Even the pulpit and the drawing room had fallen silent under its spell. The audience was about to see how powerless hospitals became when faced with this dependence. Hospitals in the late 19th century stood as symbols of progress, but when it came to morphine and laudanum, they were powerless. The very institutions meant to heal had no understanding of addiction, no tools to treat it, and no willingness to acknowledge the scale of the crisis. To walk into a hospital with dependence was to walk into silence or punishment. There were no centres designed for recovery. There were only asylums for the insane or prisons for the criminal. Addiction did not fit neatly into either category, but that did not matter. People were placed where they could be hidden, not where they could be helped. Patients who begged for relief often found themselves treated as outcasts. Some hospitals chose to deny that such cases existed at all, fearing that admitting them would damage reputations. Medical records were quietly altered, deaths misattributed, and suffering left unnoted. To acknowledge that addiction was real would have meant admitting that medicine itself had created it. Instead, institutions turned their eyes away, protecting their names at the expense of the very people who needed them most. It is almost darkly comic that hospitals built to represent modern science responded to a growing epidemic by pretending it was not happening. For those who were admitted, treatment was harsh. Without a framework of care, doctors often believed the only path to recovery was forced abstinence. Patients were locked in rooms with barred windows, left to endure days of sweating, shaking, and screaming. Nurses were instructed to ignore the cries. The philosophy was simple: if the body could not reach the drug, it would eventually heal. No one considered the mental torment, the risk of collapse, or the chance of death. These men and women were not seen as patients, but as liabilities to be contained. Some were placed in asylums, institutions designed not for care but for confinement. There they were, housed alongside the mentally ill, stripped of dignity, and subjected to treatments that had little to do with their condition. Others were sent to prisons, where their dependence was reframed as criminal behaviour. Behind bars, they were punished rather than treated, their suffering treated as evidence of moral failure. In both cases, the line between illness and sin blurred until no one could distinguish the two. If we compared it to today, it would be like sending people addicted to prescription painkillers straight to solitary confinement, calling it therapy. A few hospitals attempted experiments, but these were inconsistent and poorly understood. Some tried gradual reduction, offering smaller and smaller doses over time. Others turned to alternative medicines, from herbal mixtures to alcohol, in the hope of easing withdrawal. Results varied, but failures were more common than successes. Doctors, unfamiliar with the science of dependence, often abandoned the efforts altogether. The lack of research and the unwillingness to admit the scope of the epidemic meant that no standardized care emerged. Each patient's fate depended on the chance of finding a sympathetic doctor, and such doctors were rare. Families who sought help for addicted loved ones were often left disappointed. A father who carried his son to a hospital in desperation might be told to take him home. A wife who begged for her husband's admission might see him confined to a locked room with no treatment plan. Parents who asked for help for daughters who had grown reliant on laudanum were sometimes advised to place them in asylums indefinitely. These responses created a cycle of shame. Families stopped seeking help, and patients stopped asking. The silence deepened, and the epidemic spread further in the shadows. The medical community's reluctance to address the issue was also tied to pride. To acknowledge addiction meant admitting that their own prescriptions had caused harm. Few doctors were willing to tarnish their profession by speaking openly. Journals rarely published articles about dependence, and when they did, the pieces were brief, speculative, and often dismissed. The wider public, seeing little official acknowledgement, assumed the problem was limited to the weak. The absence of research and dialogue allowed myths to grow unchecked, reinforcing stigma and erasing compassion. The only clear strategy that hospitals embraced was isolation. Patients were locked away, often in rooms without windows, stripped of contact with family, and left alone with their pain. The assumption was that without access to the drug, the craving would burn itself out. In some cases, this happened. In many others, it did not. Some patients emerged broken, their bodies and minds weakened permanently. Others died in confinement, their deaths recorded as natural causes or nervous collapse. The secrecy surrounding these cases ensured that the public rarely learned of them. The failure of hospitals reflected the larger failure of society to confront addiction. No one wanted to accept responsibility. Governments avoided regulation until pressure became overwhelming. Doctors avoided blame for their prescriptions. Families avoided the shame of admitting a relative's condition. The result was that the epidemic continued without interruption. People who sought help found only punishment, and those who remained silent found no relief. The institutions that promised healing offered nothing but walls and silence. I cannot help but think that if I had lived then, walking into a hospital with an addiction would have felt less like seeking care and more like surrendering to a prison. By the end of the century, the pattern was clear. Hospitals had failed to respond to addiction with science or compassion. They had chosen denial, confinement, and silence. This choice allowed the epidemic to spread across every class of society, unchecked and misunderstood. The reputation of medicine remained polished, but behind the polished doors, patients suffered in secret. The trust that families placed in hospitals was betrayed, not through malice, but through ignorance and pride. The tragedy of hospital